Hey, I'm Pierre, and this is how I made a slot machine roguelike pixel art dungeon crawler in a single week. Why in a single week, you might ask? I was taking part in a game jam hosted by Jackie, a fellow indie game developer and absolute rap god.
Going to knees, and I don't got underpants.
So at the announcement of the theme on Monday, I had until Sunday midnight to make something playable. This was going to be a fun, challenging and coffee-driven week. And it all started on... As we were waiting for the theme to be announced, I was playing a game a viewer made and sent me. Even if the game had a few rough edges, you could get the basic idea. This was basically a one-button RPG, where the action selected was cycling through all available options, and you had to press the action button at the right time to do what you want. This game mechanic really inspired me, and I started to wonder, what if a roguelike was controlled by slot machines? This made sense to me, as all roguelikes have something in common. Randomness. Randomness can be used to determine which monsters you will encounter, if your attack will be a critical hit or not, what attack will the monster in front of you do, what you will find in a chest, in a shop, and so on. Most roguelikes hide their randomness behind a simple random number generator, but others push this concept further. You might already know Balatro, where the inherent randomness of a shuffled deck is used. But before I discovered Balatro and spent way too much time playing it, I was playing Dicey Dungeon, a roguelike made by Terry Kavanagh. As the name suggests, Dicey Dungeon is a roguelike where you travel through a dungeon, battle enemies and roll dice that will determine how effective your actions will be. I don't exactly know why, but I really like when games give you coherent metaphors for in-game systems. But out of all the real-world randomness generator, why choose the one-armed bandits? First, slot machines are designed to be addictive. One stroll through a Las Vegas casino can convince you of that. These machines are often used as an example to explain the Skinner box concept, a famous science experiment that shows that a system that gives random rewards in a short loop is way more addictive than ones that always provide the same result. Let's just say that starting with a system proven to keep people playing can always provide a safe starting point for a game. Slot machines also have a skill aspect to it. Whereas you can't control a dice, a spinning coin or a shuffle deck, you could theoretically control a slot machine by stopping the slot at the right time, as long as the slots are spinning slowly and stops as soon as you press the button, which is obviously never the case for gambling slot machines. This adds a tiny timing minigame, and it might feel weird for a turn-based combat system, but I recall the game series that shows how such a mix can be absolutely brilliant. The Mario RPG series combat system might look like any other standard turn-based system, but it has one genius addition: timed hits. When you start an attack, you then have the opportunity to press a button at the right time to inflict a critical hit. These small details transform a usually static and strategic system and includes a way of skill expression and knowledge about the attacks and their animations. I decided to take inspiration from this and make it so the player could try and stop the machine reels at the right time to get the result they want. This will then be harder to do if you add more reels to the machine or add other timing elements like an arrow that cycles through targets and determine which enemies will take damage. At this point I had a pretty cool idea, but there was still a few minutes before the jam started, so I might have to scrap it entirely if it didn't fit the theme provided.
Theme. It keeps getting bigger. Ooh, maybe I shouldn't put the ooh at the end, yeah.
Perfect. I could simply make the slot machine have more and more reels as you level up in the game. The game jam was now on, and as I often do, I started by looking for a good color palette for the game, and making a quick mock-up to see where to put game elements on the screen, as well as getting a rough vibe of the art style. During game jams, I usually try and find small palettes with only a few colors. This allows me to avoid decision paralysis when making art or UI. To avoid spending hours looking for the right blue, just pick a palette where there's only one blue. Once I had tinkered around the mockup for a bit, I made a new project and started to create a basic slot machine. This started with a single reel. This reel contains 3 slot objects for the top, middle and bottom slots. To achieve a cycle, I first move these objects down every frame, then once the bottom slot reaches the bottom of the reel, I move everything back up. If you then hide everything outside of the reel, you achieve a simple but effective infinite loop. But the slot machine would not be complete if every slot is the same. To make the reel cycle through a list of items, I can make every slot reference an item on the list, and then when I move the slot back up, I make them each reference the next item in the list. Just add a few reels next to each other, and this already looks like a slot machine. I added a button to stop the machine, and this is where an important aspect of game development appeared: juice. You see, this machine is functional, but it lacks movement, animation, energy, personality, or in another word, juiciness. So, to improve this, I wanted to mimic how an old slot machine works. If you stop the machine while a slot isn't perfectly aligned with the middle, it will slowly move toward the middle. Then, since the mechanism isn't perfect, it overshoots a bit and sprints back. To go the extra mile, I made the machine bump up and down when you press the button, and highlight every slot from left to right once the result has been determined. The slot machine then sums up all these values and output the results. I finished the day by drawing a bunch of items that could appear in the slot machines, mainly numbers, but also icons for special effects like fire, poison, skulls, diamonds, or hearts. At this point, it was already late into the night, so I went to bed to be ready for... With the basic slot machine done, it was time to make the battle system. Here's how it works. During the adventure, the player can stumble upon a group of monsters. You then have to choose one of the weapons in your inventory, each with their own slot machines that can vary in size and content. While the weapons machine is spinning, the target arrow is cycling through the enemies. Then once you stop the machine, the target is locked, and the monster is hurt based on the output of the machine. On the monster's turn, I add up all the enemy machines in a single big machine that will represent the enemy's total attack. The player will be damaged based upon that output. I then go through this process again until either the player's health drops to 0 or every opposing monster has disappeared. After a while, you will beat every enemy. You then have another machine that lets you roll your loot, with each reel being configured by which type of enemy you just defeated. To keep track of the player's state, I added a small UI to the side that shows your character and relevant information like your health, XP, and coins. I then took a small break to go bouldering with friends, as I do every Tuesday. Well rested and the shoulders full of climbing cramps, I tackled one of the toughest yet crucial aspects of the whole project: random adventure generation. I wanted to make something similar to what you can find in games like Slay the Spire or Inscription. Basically, a start point, an end point, and in the middle a collection of rows containing points with connection between them, but no connection between points of the same row or connection crossing others. Simple enough, you might say. I can draw something like that in a few seconds, but this was way harder than expected and ended up taking the majority of my workday. I even considered just making a few maps by hand and calling it a day. But I pushed through and finally got something working. This is how the map generation works. First, I create 1 to 4 points in each row. To avoid cramming too many connections to any single point, I restrict the number of points so that it is only different of 2 or less from the previous row. Then I make the basic connections between the rows. Each point can be connected to the one directly above it, or the one above and to the right. If the point doesn't have any points above it, I connect it to the last point in the row. And I do the same if the row above has more points than the current row. Then I look for flippable connections. These are connections that could be flipped around. Basically all diagonal connections apart from the one emanating from the points at the end of rows. I then randomly flip a number of these flippable connections. Once the connections are done, I can then transform those points based on what can appear in the level. Finally, to make things look nicer, I center everything and add a tiny random offset to every point in order to make it more organic. Traveling the map was pretty easy as I had data about what point your current position is connected to. I just highlighted the available destinations when opening the map after a battle, then start a new battle or event once the destination has been chosen. Having spent about 6 hours on this feature, I wanted to make the first area different than a standard battle, a shop. After I drew the good old hooded traveling merchant, I reused the weapon selection UI to show the goods available, and wrote some descriptions for every item. You might wonder how I managed to color specific parts of the text or add images. Most game engines provide markers you can add to specify how to render specific parts of your text. In Unity it's called rich text, but since I'm using Godot this time around, I will be using their BB code system. One issue with this approach is that sometimes the text can become unlegible for me as I create them, and I also have to keep in mind what exact hex code or resources path to use. To make things simpler for me, I created an interpreter function. This function takes a string, then looks for simple markers I add inside of it, like coin, red, or shake, and replaces it with actual BB code. This way, when writing descriptions, I can just use these simple custom-made markers instead of the actual BB code. Other than weapons, the player can also buy single-use items like bombs or potions, or artifacts that can give special effects. But let's not talk about that just yet. In the morning, I continued adding new events to the map, and after the shop, I needed a way to let the player rest between battles. But rather than simply healing the player, let's add another slot machine. You can rest and spin this machine as many times as you want, but every time you do, I add a skull to the reels. If you land on a skull, you are woken up by a random battle. This is a nice way to allow the player to push their luck in time of need, which adds a layer of strategy and stress to rests. With that feature done, and since I was basically at the midway point, I decided to spend the rest of the day to draw all the content necessary for the game. Weapons, items, and artifacts were pretty simple, but I still had to draw and animate 20 monsters. With 6 hours left, that's an average of 18 minutes per monster. So I hooked up a timer, booted as sprites, and went ham. Slimes, skeletons, spiders, knight, minotaur, and so on. I was moving at a nice pace, but I knew that the last sprites would be the toughest ones. And I was right, because the Hydra took me 40 minutes. But I still finished in only 6 hours and 6 minutes, so only about 1.6% above my estimation, which is pretty good. Yet I still had to put everything in the game. Okay, now that I had all the content made, I worked on the game systems, starting with the level up system. You earn experience for every defeated enemy, and once you reach your level target, you earn an additional reel on all your weapon slot machines. But I wanted to add more stats for the player, like strength, luck, toughness, and wisdom. Rather than simply increasing all these stats or making the player spend points on specific skills, I added yet another slot machine. This way, every run strategy has to be adapted based on your skill makeup. To showcase these values, I made the inventory screen, where I also displayed your current weapons, items, and artifacts. With these few features done, I went to tackle one last complex system, status effects. 3 negatives, namely burning, poison, and confusion, and 1 positive I called focus. Status effects can be stacked and decreases over time, so I specified decrease amounts for each one. Poison decreased by 1 each turn, but burning only lasts a turn, for example. To inflict these statuses, I check for specific items in slot machine outputs. Then after each player or monster turn, the damages are determined using slot machines. To keep things interesting, all these statuses behave differently. For the burn, the slot machine size depends on how bad the burn is. For the poison, the slot machine is always the same size, but the damage is based on how much you are poisoned. For confusion, I add zeros to all weapon reels, making you miss attacks. And finally, for focus, I add a special multiplier to final weapon reel that multiplies the total damage by 2. Once all the statuses were working on both player and monsters, I spent the rest of the day working on artifacts. These can have lots of different effects on a wide variety of systems. These can be quite hard to systemize, so rather than trying to make a complex system, I simply added checks in the game's code for specific items and made changes accordingly. With this simple approach, I implemented the 15 artifacts I had planned in just a couple of hours, which was great because it meant I had a bunch of time left to do some music and sound design. I used one of my favorite tricks, making 2 separate versions of the same track with different intensity, and seamlessly fade to the high intensity one when entering a battle. I then added a few sound effects for things like spinning, damaging monsters, buying stuff, and so on. Okay, so at this point, the game was running smoothly, but I still needed a bunch of crucial elements to call the game complete. With only 2 days left, I went into crunch mode. First crucial thing, adding a main menu. I reused the slot machine code to make an animated title, added a simple animation for the background and a couple of buttons. As I was working on menus, I also implemented a simple settings menu with a slider to adjust the overall game speed, because I knew as I would add things to the game, it would become longer and longer to test. Then no game would be complete without a game over and win screen. Just a simple text and a retry button will do the trick. I then tackled something that might appear insane considering I only had about 30 hours left at this point, a save system. At first, I considered not making one since the game has a ton of data to keep track of. You have player values like health, experience, inventory, and so on, but also all the map information. Where the points are, all the connections, what each point contains. This seemed like one hell of a task. Until a viewer suggested a simpler solution, using seeds. You see, in games, randomness is often accompanied with a special number called a seed. When given the same seed, the random number generator will always give the same output. This way, rather than saving the entire map, I could just save the seed, which is just a number, and then regenerate the map from this seed using the same algorithm as the one used to generate it at the start of the game. I then saved the player's position on the map and put it back where it was once you load a saved game. With these less crucial features in place, I only had a single task left on my to-do list. Make all the monsters, battle compositions and level biomes. So after a small break to go and see a concert, I went back at my place late into the night to continue working. Wait, what time is it actually? Before starting the huge undertaking that is designing all the battles and monsters, I wanted to add a small UI that would show enemy health and statuses. It's a bit rough around the edges, but it works. Okay, time to start level designing. This is pretty straightforward, but it's a lot of data entry. I first set up all the values for every monster. Things like health, name, animation, what attack to include in their slot machine, as well as what XP and loot to give out once beaten. With these enemies, I can set up all battles for every biomes. This is simply 2 lists of monsters, one for the front row and one for the back. I made about 15 battles for every biome, divided in 4 categories. Start battles, which are really easy to let the player have a guaranteed victory when they start a new game or a new biome. Normal battles, which are the meat of the game and will be prevalent on the map. Hard battles that can only show up in the second half of the map. And boss battles, that are specific battles to end a specific biome. I kept trying out the game as soon as I finished the biome to see if I should tweak some monsters, try to keep everything balanced. At this point, I had about 6 hours left on the clock. So I decided to add a new map event for a chest that uses a special slot machine to determine what kind of treasure you will get. The more diamonds you land on, the better the loot, and if you land on a skull, the treasure chest transforms into a mimic that you have to battle immediately. It was now time to export the game and have people try it to see if there were some bugs or things to improve difficulty-wise. Fortunately, I have some really enthusiastic viewers that started playing as soon as I posted the link. And this was really valuable, because even if they were really enjoying the game, they pretty much all had the same problems. First, they were all looking for shops to spend the huge amount of money they were hoarding. The map generation process was randomly picking map points, but you could have a complete run with absolutely no shop or rest area. To prevent this, I implemented a small check at the end of the map generation to see if there were less than 2 shops on the map, and transform random points into shops to meet the minimum. This process is then run again for camps. Next, I felt like there wasn't any incentive to use different weapons. You could literally finish the game with only your starting weapons, as you become stronger with each level up. To combat this, I quickly added a durability system to weapons so that they would break after a certain number of uses. This allowed me to better balance weapons, as I could make some weapons stronger, but give them limited uses. At this point, I had been awake for 38 hours, so it was time to call it a day. I exported the project, made some assets for each page, and released everything to the public. And here's how the game looked in the end. Right now, I think I will let this project settle for a bit. I did come back to it the next day to tweak some values, as a lot of players complained of a big difficulty spike in the 3rd biome. I have tons of ideas to improve the game, like new biomes, more complex enemy behaviors like spawning new enemies, more weapons, random events, new starting characters, achievements, and so on. But I already have a couple of projects to work on, so I might only sporadically update this one. What do you think? Should I keep working on this? Let me know in the comments, and I will see you in the next one. Peace!